A couple of years ago, a friend and I decided to go to the site of the Ludlow Massacre to talk about this workers' uprising that happened in the mountains of Colorado in 1914. And this happened on April 20th, which is a day very important for American history. You had the first shot of the revolution. And then in World War II, you had the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So April 20th is a very important day for working people from around the world. And this is when their union uprising was put down brutally, and many people were killed.
I think that when the shooting started, the machine gun was on the hill over there, and the tent colony was mostly over here. And when the dead were killed, they had to bring them into this cellar. I'm surprised to see it open. Did I see the camera there? Take my hat off.
At the time I filmed this, I didn't really know the full context of what happened here, but I'll go a little bit more into detail about the deaths that occurred at the specific cellar I'm in. But what you need to know is that the death special was going around. It was a armored car with a machine gun on the back of it, and it randomly was spraying into the tent colony because these were people who were fired from their job for being pro-union, and they couldn't actually go anywhere else, so they just camped next to the railroad tracks. But they had to camp about 15 feet off of the railroad track because that was also a property that forbade union workers from it. And so they were there, and the sheriff requested, out of this camp of hundreds of people, Louis Tikas to come forward, who was sort of their leader. And Louis Tikas came forward under the white flag of truce, and he was shot in the back of the head. And then the death special started going through the town as Union busters started lighting fire to all of the tents. And this water tower as well had a machine gun on top of it. So amid all of this fire and all of this gunshots, a group of people went into the cellar underneath that area to try to seek safety. And they died because these anti-union guys were going through catching all of the tents on fire. And you have remains of the company town around here. And I mean, you can look into the company town system all you want. This area specifically was owned by a Rockefeller, and it was set up to be a sort of capitalist utopia where naturally the company bosses were on top, and everybody else had to pay rent to the guys who owned it, had to pay rent to the company, had to only go to company shops using company money, and the remains of what you see are the company stores, the company schools, and all of the sort of company shops and housing and really everything was controlled by the company. You made your wage from them, and basically you paid taxes to them, you paid rent to them, and by the end of all of that, you would very often be in debt to them. So it was basically a system of slavery. And of course, if you left, all of your money, which was company funny money, it was called scrib, was now legally useless tender. So you were out of luck. You were basically an outlaw, and you robbed, of all people, the Rockefellers who owned the company. So good luck getting a lawyer to represent you over a Rockefeller. And this is very important to a lot of labor organizers. So you can see that this is basically, it's a mecca for union workers who come out here, and you can still see the wobbly logos. An injury to one is an injustice to all, and the pipe fitters and all of these are people who are not just kind of Tumblr leftists. These are real left-wing activists. These are sort of the Teamsters. These are the real workers. And these are the real people who get shit done. And this is just me kind of walking around the sand dunes. But in the next video, I'll kind of explore some of these sites because we went back later up the valley to see what was really up there. At a later date, we went back to Ludlow, and if you follow the Louis Tikas Highway, directly up the valley, you'll come across a less desert type site and into a more forested area. And you can see the remains of the old mines all around here. In fact, it's amazing. I've seen a lot of videos of people going to the site of the massacre, but not to the site of the mines. And what's so interesting about this is the fact that there are some small memorials scattered around here to victims of mine disasters. In fact, actually, this area, this meadow, is where the colony was, the tent colony, which was only saved, I forgot to mention in the last video, as a train drove by, blocking the fire and allowing a lot of people to board the train and escape. But if you take a look around, for example, this monument is to 121 men who died only a few years after the massacre in 1914. This explosion happened in 1917. And up here you see the remains of old structures that belonged to the company. And again, I should mention that this is the property of one of the Rockefellers. The Rockefeller family was more heavily involved in entrepreneurialism, in philanthropy, but they were not so much involved in actually creating companies. And I've heard some conspiracies that they kind of more or less intended for an uprising to take place because they liked to talk about advocacy for the workers. But really, they came from old money and they really didn't know how to manage people, at least not back in 1914 when they were running the Ludlow mines. These are old charcoal kilns. This is kind of the area where they would purify a lot of the ore, and it stretches for a good half-mile down the road there. And I believe this is a gigantic elk. And there's wildlife all over here. I'm sad to admit, but a deer jumped in front of my car on the way back. The deer was fine, but be very careful when you drive through remote parts of Colorado. As far as I understand it, in this cemetery, Louis Tikas is buried. They brought his body here. It's in Trinidad, and there's a few sites associated with the miners in Trinidad. A separate cemetery, as I was talking about at the old cellar, you have the family, the grave of the family that took shelter inside of the small tent, went down into the cellar, and wasn't able to actually come up to the surface until they had died of smoke inhalation, and then later their bodies had been burned by the fire that was raging because, it was a bloodbath. It was actual war. And this was the Costa family. You had age 6, age 4, 31, and 27. This was most of these people are younger than me. Only Charlie Costa is older than me. And it's kind of crazy to think about the brutality that was shown towards people for not even for any kind of real activism. It was just because they were laborers. It was because the people on the top felt that they had one up on the people below them, even though they were only one or two rungs up above the workers. And if you look around the cemetery, you can see graves with writing that shows that most of these immigrants came from Eastern Europe rather than from Mexico. Back in the day, we hired a lot of people from Italy, from Slovenia, from Czechoslovakia, and just looking around is testimony to this. A lot of people from the Balkans, Frank Pomsik, and in Trinidad itself, the sun is setting here, but you have a statue of Louis Tikas. And it's kind of amazing that they erected this because for the longest time, there was this narrative that Tikas himself was a sort of communist. And it's patently untrue. He was from Crete, the island of Greece, and a lot of workers came from Crete, and a lot of organizers came from Crete because they understood the importance of coming together. And if you take a look at the coal miners memorial, you can see hundreds of names of people not who were killed in conflict, but who were simply killed by neglect. And any time a union came together, generally their first issue of concern was how do we get this list to stop expanding every single day? Because people were dying every day, and if you look at the names, if you pause the video, most of those are from Eastern Europe, are from Mexico, are from places that are overseas. And obviously you had a lot of poor Americans there as well, but these are people who felt really exploited. And this is now far south Colorado, just on the border with New Mexico, where I believe what spurred it on were a number of horrible disasters in New Mexico.